Good afternoon and welcome to ARC's Literacy Webinar Series. I'm Amelia Larson and I serve as the EVP of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. ARC is an organization founded by and run by educators in pursuit of love, literacy, and liberty. Our work is designed to create the types of schools where all students are served well and thrive. We draw specific attention to the needs of students from historically marginalized and underserved groups by creating a sense of belonging and safety and engaging all students in high levels of literacy work that honors their intellect, culture, and communities. Few housekeeping items. Closed captioned has been enabled for those who would like a live transcript. We are recording today's session and hope to share it with all of you. You will receive an email in a few days with resources from this webinar, as well as information about our upcoming webinars. We truly have an incredible lineup. I encourage you to join the conversation through the chat feature, and if you have comments or questions, continue to post them in the chat. Now, I would like to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Sonia Cabell, Associate Professor, School of Teacher Education and Florida Center for Reading Research, Florida State University. Dr. Cabell's research focuses on the prevention of reading difficulties among young children who are at risk, particularly those who are living in poverty. Dr. Cabell's work, spanning from pre-kindergarten through second grade, consists of how to strengthen children's language and literacy skills that serve as precursors to both successful reading comprehension, word recognition, and I would say life. She has 2 books coming out: Literacy Learning for Infants, Toddlers, and Preschoolers, Key Practices for Educators, and also the Handbook on the Science of Early Literacy. Boy, do we need that. David Liben, advisor, Achieve the Core, and co-author of Know Better, Do Better, Teaching the Foundation so Every Child Can Read. David is a nationally recognized reading expert who is uniquely able to translate research on the brain and reading into practical applications for teachers and students. Prior to being involved with the Common Core state standards and helping educators in all settings make the shifts they need so students can thrive, David taught and led schools at all grade levels during a 35 school-based career. 35 years. Wow. Thank you for your service. And last but not least, Natalie Wexler is an education writer and the author of The Knowledge Gap, The Hidden Cause of America's Broken Educational System and How to Fix It. And she's also the co-author of The Writing Revolution, a guide to advancing thinking through writing in all subjects and grades. She's a senior contributor to the Education Channel on Forbes, and her articles and essays on education and other topics have appeared on the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journals, and other publications. Aren't we lucky? Welcome, welcome all of you. We're so happy to have you with us today. I'm going to get started with a little bit of background. The last couple of weeks have been pretty busy. Everybody talking about the latest NAEP scores before and after COVID. And we have seen the news saying the latest NAEP reading scores showed the largest drop in reading achievement since the 1980s. But reading had declined for the nation's lowest performing 4th and 8th graders, including students from all racial and ethnic groups, before the pandemic. And if you think about it, the average reading scores had been basically stagnant. Natalie, in your most recent newsletter, Minding the Gap, you wrote, "No, COVID hasn't erased 2 decades of progress in education. You say, dig deeper into national test scores, and you will find there has been little or no progress for most of that time. And you finish by saying, if what we were doing for students wasn't working before, there is no point in just doubling down. So, Natalie, get us started. What's missing? What are we getting wrong here? What's missing from this conversation?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I should say, if you look back to the early 1970s, there was progress. But starting in about 1998 for reading and about 2010 for math, scores became, as you said, stagnant or more recently declining. And the gap between high scorers and low scorers was widening. And so the most recent results do show a dramatic drop, but it's not a break with the past. It was not an unbroken story of progress until COVID came along. So we can't, as you mentioned, just think if we just do more of what we were doing before COVID, we will address those learning losses and everything will be fine. We need to do something fundamentally different, or we stand to lose whatever progress we could have made. And I'd say that fundamentally different thing is what we're going to be talking about today, which is, especially at the elementary level, switching from a focus on reading comprehension skills and strategies in a decontextualized way to an approach that focuses primarily on building kids' academic knowledge and vocabulary, because those reading tests, although they appear to be testing abstract skills and things like finding the main idea or making inferences, they are actually, as cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham has said, they're knowledge tests in disguise. Because, and it's not just about tests, it's also about reading high school textbooks or newspapers or job manuals. If you don't have relevant background knowledge and knowledge of vocabulary, you can't understand the reading passage and you never get a chance to demonstrate your skill at finding the main idea or making inferences or whatever. So if we do want to boost not only test scores, but academic chances of academic success and success in life for all kids, that's what we need to do. We need to make that kind of fundamental switch.
Thank you. David, Sonia, anything you want to add?
I would like to add that some of my work is focused on programs that integrate knowledge and literacy in the early grades. And in the K through 5 space, there seems to be an impact on vocabulary and comprehension for children when you integrate literacy and content knowledge. That appears to be more effective than siloed approaches. My colleagues and I have a recent meta-analysis where we looked at this integration and approaches that integrate. And there seems to be, there is definitely something to that that's very powerful. Yeah. And so I think when we think about knowledge building, we should be thinking about it in the context of children's literacy and thinking about how we can integrate those.
Thank you. Thank you.
David? The other thing I would add is that in addition to having text that grows students' knowledge about the world and themselves, the questions and tasks have to address the knowledge. If the questions and tasks only address how you use the table of contents or how reading informational text is different, what is still, although hopefully diminishing, the most popular program in the United States, Units of Study, does have more knowledge-based text in their revisions, as do some other programs because the standards call for half informational text. But the questions don't address the knowledge or only peripherally address the knowledge. And that's one of the key ways to look at what is really a knowledge-based curriculum, what is, I don't know what you would call it, fake knowledge.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking more about that. Thank you for bringing that up. And I am going to turn to you, Sonia, now, because there has been like wide recognition that like the science of reading movement has served as an important catalyst for change, right? For potential powerful change for promoting improved outcomes. But just recently, the scientific committee from the Knowledge Matters campaign came out with some cautioning statements regarding this movement. And just recently, this past weekend, Tim Shanahan kind of echoed the caution in his latest blog, Phonics First or Phonics Early. Can you expand on this? And what is your advice for district, but also for parents?
So the Knowledge Matters campaign, for those of you who might not be familiar with the organization, they were launched in 2015 by education thought leaders who were really concerned with the role of background knowledge in reading and wanted to make sure that knowledge was built in the elementary grades, because it's oftentimes in the earliest grades, there isn't necessarily robust science and social studies instruction going on. And I'm part of that scientific advisory board that issued that statement. And one of the things that we discuss in the statement is that the science of reading, it means different things to different people, but a lot of times there is an emphasis on decoding or phonics to many people when they think about the science of reading. But the science is so much more than that. The science is ever evolving, accumulated knowledge on how reading develops, how we teach reading. And there are many parts to the science. And so this statement that we issued really elevates the important role of language comprehension to reading, and specifically how prior knowledge is needed to understand a given topic, and how it's important not just to activate that knowledge, but to build that knowledge of children's knowledge of the natural and social world. And so this particular website offers not only the statement, but it offers an opportunity to see curricula, content-rich English language arts curricula in action.
And we are seeing, parents like getting really involved and hearing about the reading wars and the push for phonics. What is your advice for parents and for districts that want to inform parents? David, can I start with you and then go on to both Natalie and Sonia?
Well, for parents, you have to do your homework and see if the district that you're enrolled in uses a systematic phonics program. If not, you can do whatever you can to lobby the school to bring something in, since schools seems to be a place that parents are now lobbying for all kinds of reasons. But that would certainly be one that I would recommend. And if not, then you have to take it on yourself, and you have to look into the programs that you can use to do that. And there are a bunch out there. I don't want to recommend one that is better than the rest. I suppose if any parents, I have looked at them. I've looked at many of them, and I guess Sonia, Amelia, if any parent wants to. I have reviews of some of those programs that could be used at home that I'd be glad to share with anybody.
I guess what is also important is that we help parents understand that knowledge building curricula is out there that not only addresses foundational skills, but like Sonia was saying, builds knowledge. Sonia, we have Matt Copeland has a question, and he said, how do we define reading for parents? Is it simply like word recognition? Is it meaning making? How do we define it?
It's definitely both. So I'm glad that you brought up this question, because I was going to highlight it in the chat. I think that we don't need to be overly simplistic on what reading is to parents. Right. One of the things we want parents to do with children is read with them and discuss stories with them. And if we can have them see the importance of building their knowledge early on through knowledge in books and experiences that they might have with children. It's those conversations that happen before, during, and after reading those texts that matter for children's language learning and their knowledge. You can build their knowledge simultaneously. So I would say both of those things. So because it doesn't diminish the importance of phonics or word recognition, that we know that's essential. But also we know that meaning making is essential, and that's really about building language from the earliest point in their life.
And we are going to add for you 2 resources. Natalie wrote an article for AFT that talked about what elementary curriculums should do. I don't remember exactly the title, but also, David, you wrote an article with Barbara Davidson that talks about what does knowledge building curriculum looks like in the classroom. So I think empowering parents with this information, like Sonia said, that is not just one thing, is really, really critical. But I want to stay with this a little bit more, and I'm going to start with you, Natalie. What is the science of reading to you? What do you want people to understand about the science of reading?
Well, I think, as with many terms in education, the science of reading means different things to different people. And I do think it has, as Sonia was alluding to, and it's often defined as just about decoding and phonics. But of course, we know reading is about much more than that. I would actually prefer a term like science of literacy, which would encompass not just reading, but also speaking, listening, and I'll talk about this a little more later, and writing as well as reading. And they are all connected. They're all components of literacy, and we need to see them working together. Even beyond that, I might advocate a phrase like science of learning, because when you get to comprehension, it's not just even about literacy. It is about everything. I mean, everything that you know can be involved in understanding what you read. There's an added layer of complexity if you compare it to listening, because you also have to be able to decode, and you need to know this about the complex syntax of written language. But I think we have gotten ourselves into a bit of trouble by using the term reading to refer to 2 actually very different things: decoding and comprehension. So that's my 2 cents on that.
I like that, science of literacy and science of learning. Sonia, what is the science of reading to you?
I also think that the science of reading should also encompass the science of writing. So science of reading and writing, Steve Graham argued for that in a 2020 Reading Research Quarterly article. And I think they've been too siloed for too long. So oftentimes teachers get the mistaken impression that they're not related, but they're really related, especially when children are really, really young. But when I think about the science of reading, I view it as a positive that teachers are looking to the science to guide practice and gain knowledge, rather than just allowing, every product to be stamped with research-based, which is what happened, in after 2000, in the late 90s. There was a really big marketing and curriculum shift between the late 90s and the early 2000s after the National Reading Panel report came out. Then all of a sudden, everything was stamped with scientifically based reading research. And I know that the skeptics out there might think it's the same sort of thing is happening. Everything is stamped with the science of reading. But I think there's an attention to primary scientific findings, the research, more than there was at that time. I was a teacher during that time. And a reading first coach during that time. So I view what people are paying attention to now is really different. For example, I heard Linnea Airy recently say that her work is now blossoming, meaning she was trying to communicate that now people in the public or teachers know and are interested in the work, not just researchers. And that was exciting. Scarborough's rope, things like that weren't the simple view, things like that weren't necessarily talked about, 20 years ago. But I think about the science of reading being both basic and applied research, both about how reading develops and also about practices for instruction. And it also accumulates and changes over time. It's not just one thing. I know people want to just that one thing, that will make the scores be wonderful, but it changes and accumulates over time as the scientific, scientific knowledge grows, and that's the nature of science.
Thank you. David, we have a question in the chat, and the question is from Kevin, and he says, what is the distinguishable difference between disciplinary literacy for older readers and knowledge-based reading? Can you provide a couple of examples?
Disciplinary literacy focuses on what distinguishes each discipline. So in history, there's an emphasis on finding sources, evaluating sources, looking at how sources might differ in the same approaching the same era. Like, what are you writing about Reconstruction after the Civil War? What sources are you using, and how do the sources differ? In science, it's the scientific process. In other words, what was the nature of the research that conclusions were drawn based on this science? What was the methodology? What was the type of evidence used, and was it replicated, and was it in a peer-reviewed journal? And that can also apply to social studies. And as Kevin said, that's for older readers. The knowledge-based reading is what we've been talking about. When students read topics, when they're learning all of the elements of the science of reading that Sonia and Natalie talked about, and they're learning it through topics that they're reading about, and that learning could include fiction as well as nonfiction. I want to include something also. It's important. Disciplinary literacy, understanding the nature of the disciplines. But if you don't know much history, it doesn't really matter if you understand the nature of the disciplines. One of the first lessons I ever did when I was teaching in Harlem in the 7th grade, as I was assistant principal in school, but I was teaching 7th grade American history, and which we integrated with literacy all the time. And I remember I began with, well, how are we going to begin history? American history, where should we begin? And these kids had come from schools where they had zero knowledge grown and zero where they were asked these kinds of questions. So they were pretty dead in the water. They wouldn't come up with anything. Being the assistant principal, I said, well, we're not going to recess until somebody comes up with something. So let's just keep thinking, where do we begin? And you got answers like Columbus, like Native Americans. Somebody said God. So you get all these different answers, and they say, well, how are we going to decide that? And then, of course, they were dead again. But then I threatened them again with more loss of recess. And finally, somebody said, well, you get a book, or you see and I thought that was great. And I pulled out of my desk, carefully prepared 7 books, including one from the Soviet Union, which, according to that book, American history began with slavery. And so they got that point. Going down the stairs that very same day, 2 kids got into an argument about whether or not the mayor actually owned the city. The point is that it's one thing to deal with methodology, but if you don't have some sense of knowledge about history, then disciplinary literacy is not terribly effective, I don't think, if you come into middle school and you've got no background in American history whatsoever, so that you think, or the way the system works, and you think that mayors own cities. So it's both. It's growing knowledge, even at the secondary level.
So we're going to shift to talking a little bit more deeply about high quality curriculum. There are some questions in the chat related to what are some examples of knowledge building curricula. And Todd asked that question. And Todd, if you go, I'm just going to very briefly, before I pass it on to Natalie, I am going to briefly show you the Knowledge Matters campaign. You can go from here, like explore curricula, visit classrooms, learn more about it. Like, this is a wonderful resource that I would start digging. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this, because everybody wants to be science of reading. Everybody wants to be also knowledge building. So I'm going to start with you, Natalie. What counts as high quality curriculum? What counts as knowledge building, and who gets to decide? So can you start with us?
Sure. So I think there are certain, I mean, there are now maybe half a dozen, I would say, good knowledge building curricula, and they cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways, but I think they all have at least a couple of things in common. And one is that they're organized by topic rather than like the skill of the week. They put the content in the foreground, and they spend at least 2-3 weeks, sometimes much more, on a specific topic. And that's important because it gives kids repeated exposure to the same concepts and vocabulary. And that's what you need for those things to lodge in their long-term memory, where they can help them understand texts in the future. And the other thing is that they give all students in the classroom access to complex grade level or above grade level text in some way. And that could be through the teacher reading aloud and leading class discussion. So those are the things I would say to look for.
Now, can you talk, because you have some fascinating slides that talk a little bit about the design in cognitive science. Can you take us there?
Sure. So I'll share my screen.
Okay.
So yeah, this is a diagram that it just sort of represents processes in the mind when we're taking in new information. And the important thing here is that middle box there that says working memory. That's the part of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. And the important thing to know about working memory is it is very limited. It can only juggle maybe 4 or 5 items for about 20 seconds before it starts to get overwhelmed and we may forget or not have the cognitive capacity to think about and understand what we're trying to take in. And that burden on working memory is called cognitive load by cognitive scientists. And the best way to get around these limitations on working memory is to have things stored in that last box on the right, long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. So if we can just withdraw relevant information that we have stored in long-term memory, we don't have to juggle that information in working memory. And that frees up more space in working memory to think about the new information we're trying to take in. So this is really why having relevant prior knowledge helps, well, not just with comprehension, but with all learning. But there are a couple of tricks here. One is that we have to initially transfer new information into long-term memory, so it's there. And then we also have to be able to retrieve relevant information when we need it. So one good way to transfer information is to attach some meaning to it. That could be maybe by explaining it to someone else. And in order to be able to retrieve information when we need it, we need to practice retrieving that item. And that could be through quizzing, that could be, again, through explaining it orally or in writing. So that's the basic idea of what's going on and why knowledge helps us with comprehension. And it's important to keep in mind that different aspects of literacy impose different levels of cognitive load. So as I mentioned before, literacy is not just about reading. So there's also listening, and particularly listening to text being read aloud, because written text is almost always more complex than spoken language. If kids are eventually going to understand that complex syntax and vocabulary of written text, they need to get used to it. And one way to get them familiar with it is by reading text aloud. And another thing to bear in mind here is that on average, kids' listening comprehension exceeds their reading comprehension until they're about age 13. So it's not just when they're little and they can't decode. This goes on for a while. And that means that this is going to be the most efficient way to build academic knowledge and vocabulary is through listening. And this graph was done in 1984. This information has been around for a long time, but also speaking. I don't know if you can see that, but talking about what you've just heard, using the same vocabulary that you've just heard, that's how you're going to really help that stick in long-term memory. As I mentioned, explaining it, attaching meaning to it. So before students are fluent readers, and that could be beyond age 13 for some students, they acquire knowledge most efficiently through listening to complex text and speaking, talking about that text. So let's then look at how a knowledge building curriculum can help modulate cognitive load, that burden on working memory, and boost student learning and boost students' ability to read and write. So remember, we've got listening and speaking, reading and writing. These are the 4 basic components of literacy. And listening and speaking are easier. They impose less of a cognitive load, less of a burden on working memory. We don't have to teach kids how to do those things. They come naturally. So as I mentioned, that's going to be the most efficient way to build knowledge. And then that can fuel these more difficult, cognitively difficult tasks of reading, and especially writing, which is even more challenging than reading, even though we spend less time on it. So in other words, if you have listened to a text about, let's say, sea mammals, and then you've talked about sea mammals and used that vocabulary, it's going to be easier for you to read about sea mammals and also write about sea mammals. So to sort of sum up here, an effective curriculum will, first of all, focus on content and spend at least 2 to 3 weeks on a single topic, if not more. Secondly, give all students access to the same complex text through read-alouds and discussion. And I should mention here that not all knowledge-building curricula rely on having teachers read complex text aloud after 2nd grade or so. But if your students are having difficulty reading complex text independently, this is something to bear in mind, a way to modify that curriculum. Try reading that text aloud, having a discussion on it, and then have students read it or read a similar text once they've got that information in long-term memory. And then thirdly, an effective curriculum will engage students in listening, speaking, reading, and writing about the same content. That's really not what the standard approach to literacy instruction today does. We have kids often reading level texts on topics that have nothing to do with what they may have heard about during a read aloud, and then maybe writing about a completely separate topic, maybe in a separate writing curriculum. And that's not taking advantage of the way that we can build that knowledge through listening and speaking and make reading and writing actually easier for kids, enable them to read and write at a higher level. So that's the overall picture.
Thank you. And David, I'm going to switch to you and I'm going to ask you to talk about design, but we have some questions related to how do kids have choice and voice? So as you talk a little bit more about the design, I'm going to ask you to use ARC as the example, because I think ARC really exemplifies this balance of building knowledge within a topic that is fun and engaging that kids can relate to, but also giving kids choice and freedom. So talk a little bit about the design.
What ARC does in the research lab is everybody is reading a core text, which is at grade level on a topic. So let's say it's sea mammals. So everybody's reading a core grade level text on sea mammals, and each child chooses a related subtopic. So they might choose dolphins, they might choose whales, they might choose orca, or what used to be called killer whales. They might choose any one of a myriad of topics related to sea mammals. And the whole focus of the instruction is to build up their knowledge to become experts. And what that does is they're reading complex grade level text, which is essential, with some of the supports of read aloud and other supports that Natalie mentioned. So they get that experience to work with complex text. But also there are numerous texts in ARC at different levels. So the student who wants to do whales could start off with a simple text. Let's say, I think they do sea mammals somewhere in the 3rd or 4th grade. So they could start off with a simpler text if they're weaker readers, but then they can go on to a stronger text. And it's very clear that when students build their knowledge with simpler texts, it moves on, it helps them read more complex text that might be their traditionally measured independent level. And so it not only makes sense based on the science of comprehension, based on the science of vocabulary growth, because reading a series of texts on a topic also maximizes vocabulary growth, but it works on motivation. Everybody is into it. And, for example, I saw in one art class, 2 students up front, there was one boy who was clearly reading grade level or above, and his partner was a girl who was well below grade level, not as confident as he was. and they worked together, which was really nice to see, which is very easy to do in ARC. But also when I was about to leave, she pulls out her book. And she was going to show me what her books were and where she was with her research topic. And I think it's key to these knowledge-based topics. Certainly, learning about the world is motivating. Very few kids go home to their parents and talk about, what inferences did you make this week? Let me tell you about the inferences I made this week. That's not the way it works. As opposed to, let me tell you what I learned about whales. And then, the biggest whale is a whale shark, et cetera. That's motivating. But what else is motivating? And I think all of the panelists have touched on this in one way or another, is everybody's reading the same thing. So the weakest readers are no longer confined to Fontes and Pinnell jail or to Fontes and Pinnell system of apartheid. They're all studying the same topics together, and they're all reading the core text together. And I've seen this in a number of programs, including ARC and others, and teachers say, my weaker readers are more motivated than I ever thought they could be. So the knowledge is a motivator, but putting everybody together as an intellectual community to learn about the world is also a motivator. And I would say, actually, for teachers, the teachers enjoy the knowledge, and teachers, I think it's kindergarten or first grade where they learn about Mesopotamia, which some people think is developmentally inappropriate, which it's not. And some teachers really love that, and they get into it. But overall, what fuels the teachers is how everybody is motivated, and they're not separated. And that's important and doesn't get the attention that it deserves.
I also like Sarah's questions because in a knowledge building curriculum, you are building kids' capacity to learn how to learn. And they marshal, evaluate, organize evidence, they debate, and they can take those skills and really learn anything else outside of school that they are invested in. But it is a foundation that helps them really go to the next level in terms of studying whatever they want to study. And I like Matt's comment that sometimes listening and speaking are not easier. If you see kids towards the end of a project when they are reading each other's work and debating about facts, I agree with you. They get pretty passionate about it. Sonia, I'm going to ask you for you to comment a little bit in terms of the design, in terms of content and cohesion.
Yes, I want to, in terms of cohesion, I think you're getting at the kind of the coherence of the learning. So a lot of times, in our in schools, student learns something in the morning, which is completely unconnected to what they're learning in the afternoon. It's completely unconnected to, and the next day there's completely unconnected learning from the day before, especially in English language arts, and this hopping around from topic to topic. So when you stay on a topic and use conceptually coherent text sets, whether to read aloud or that students are reading themselves, one of the things that it affords students is being able to learn and hear related language and ideas. So words, vocabulary words, for example, are being repeated, or words that are like those words are, they're developing these whole knowledge networks and semantic networks and growing those, versus it just being kind of hit or miss. And the way I like to think about that is a spider web. Let's say you have a topic in the middle, and let's say, I'm in Florida, so let's say your topic is winter. So a child in Florida might have a really different, their web might be really different than a child where it snows a lot, let's say in Massachusetts. And so just like a spider web, if things are really tight and beautifully kind of formed, you're going to have, things, flies and things like that can't pass through, they get stuck. So the same idea is that knowledge and ideas and words get stuck in that. They know where to anchor that knowledge. Whereas if you have a loose web and you don't have much understanding, then things are going to, that you learn will pass right through. So I think that what a knowledge building curriculum affords is the ability to create these beautiful webs or networks of knowledge and words.
Thank you. And I want to highlight the benefit for kids that are emergent bilinguals or multilingual learners, because this really allows them to develop the registers of language and engage with language and content at the same time as they learn more about the topic, write, talk every day, like you said, reading, writing, speaking, and listening every day, no matter what. So I want to switch a little bit, and thank you so much. I do hope that you explore the knowledge building, the Knowledge Matters campaign. They highlight 6 knowledge building curricula. They do have different personalities, so you can explore it. But it is important that you are hearing from our speakers. There is a difference in design that really benefits kids short-term and long-term. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, like, so high quality curricula is here. What now? And I want to hear from all of you, but we keep hearing about the science of reading and implementation, shifting from this balanced literacy to a more knowledge building. David, I'm going to ask you to start off, and can you touch on what are you learning? You are like the king of knowledge building curricula, and you go everywhere. What are you hearing?
I don't know if I'm the king of anything. I'm maybe the joker. But I have worked with a lot of schools and districts that are transitioning from balanced literacy to one of the knowledge-based curriculums, or are considering it. And I found a few things that have been very helpful for teachers, especially. One, as you're starting to implement this new curriculum, it does not denigrate everything that you've done in the past. I think there are things that you've done that still align with the science of reading, that still work. I think it's telling people that the research says that what you've been doing wrong for the last 1 to 25 years is all wrong, and you've been doing it with students. You haven't been making widgets. That's not the way to get buy-in or motivation. I think that's really important. Second, related, if you've got a book that you love and that has worked with kids for your entire career, they love and you love, use the book. You can't lose when everybody is gathered around a book that everybody loves, especially the teacher and the students, whether it's read aloud or not. And also the questions and the activities in these knowledge building programs are definitively aligned with the standards, and they connect to the science of reading, because many of them are about the topics and about the knowledge. But that doesn't mean that you can't add some questions based on what you know will work with your kids, or make some alterations because you think it would work better. Both those kinds of changes, keeping something that you've loved over the years and making some changes are really important. You don't park your brain when you start implementing these standards. In fact, you need your brain very much. And if you make some alterations, you are not going to go to science of reading jail. It's going to work out for you and for the kids. Every single program of all of these, and every single place that I've worked, says they have trouble with the time. They have trouble finishing in the course of a year. There is absolutely no evidence that if you miss X number of weeks that you didn't get to, that it's going to harm your kids. First of all, in terms of knowledge, they're going to learn way more knowledge in 1 year of this than they learned in 5 years. And maybe they went to social studies, but they didn't do much in social studies. A, the research is clear. There's not much time spent on social studies or science at the K-5 level. And B, what social studies or science are going to do when half the class can't read very well? How long are you going to lecture to kindergarten? So these curriculums are where knowledge grows for sure. And even if you don't finish, you're not going to harm anybody, and you're still covering far more knowledge. These curriculums are not a straitjacket. They're actually freeing, because if you start working with these curriculums, because they're core ELA programs, and the vast majority, the questions, the activities are all aligned with the standards and aligned with the science of reading. So if you're making an adjustment here and there, you don't have to be frightened about it, because so much of what you're doing is aligned with the science and is aligned with the standards. So rather than being a straitjacket, they are freeing. All that being said, when you make an adjustment, it's much better if you have had some training and some work with the science of reading. So it's important that the professional development that you get is not just how to implement the program. That is surely important, because they're very different than balanced literacy or basals, but also the science of reading. So you need PD in both professional, how to implement the program, and the science of reading, so that when you do make some of these adjustments to fit your work and your experience, you can hold them up in the light of the science of reading. And I think that's super important, because there's resistance always. And for better or worse, nothing works unless teachers understand it and believe in it. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah. At ARC, we always say, provide structure, promote self-direction. So, Sonia, in terms of like making these decisions related to making changes, can you talk a little bit about the research on what works when teachers are making these decisions?
Yeah, I think that there is a research based on what's called structured adaptations. James Kim from Harvard University has been doing this with knowledge building curricula called a knowledge building curriculum called MORE. It's an experimenter created curriculum that he developed. In addition, Susan Neuman has also done a study on a structured adaptation. But the idea here is to identify the core ingredients of the curriculum that impact children, and then coaches guide teachers in making modifications to the curriculum that don't remove those core ingredients. So like David was saying, it's important that teachers receive training on what aspects of the science relate to children's learning. And so they don't completely just take apart the whole curriculum. For example, if teachers started replacing coherent text sets that were in the curriculum with other readings and didn't use those coherent text sets, that might be a core feature, core design feature of these curricula that not to do, right? Whereas if all questions, comments, maybe words that they highlight, if some of that is altered based on their students and the students' needs, then actually those research has shown that there can be even more of an impact on children's learning. And I think largely because, in my view, what David said, largely because teachers are bought into and really understand the curriculum and what it does, because it's the teachers who teach kids, not the curriculum who teaches kids.
Yeah. Thank you. And Natalie, in terms of the knowledge building curricula, there are some political things that have come out. How do you advise districts to navigate the politics of it all?
Yeah, I mean, that is a sort of a hazard in that when you start being specific about the content you're going to teach, then it could lead to people saying, wait a minute, I don't like that content, or that's not the right content. Whereas if you're just focusing on skills, it's a little more, there's content, but it isn't specified in the curriculum. So I would say a few things about that. And I do, I worry that some of this political agitation around curriculum could, and I think this is already happening, could lead districts and educators to shy away from certain topics because they don't want to get anybody angry. But I would say, first of all, there are, as we've mentioned, maybe half a dozen different good knowledge building curricula out there, and they are different. They cover different topics in different ways. Some of them have more of an emphasis on themes relating to what you might call social justice. So districts, schools can find one that is more compatible with their communities and the values in those communities, and that can help. But of course, there's always the possibility that there'll be disagreements within the community. And I think it's important to bear in mind that often those objections are being raised by a vocal minority, and they're getting maybe attention disproportionate to their numbers. I've certainly seen this in some places where there are complaints from, a number of complaints, but very few of the people complaining actually have children enrolled in the district elementary school. So that's another thing to bear in mind. And then I think thirdly, a lot of this, ferment around curriculum has to do with how we teach history, and especially more difficult aspects of our country's history, the world's history. And I think what can be helpful is to bear in mind that it is fine to pass judgment on historical figures and events using our 21st century values, but only after we first ensured that kids understand what happened in the past, because we make certain assumptions about what kids know that are often not justified. And why are we studying someone like Thomas Jefferson? It's not primarily because he owned slaves, although that is a fact that can be brought in. But what did he actually do that makes him important to our history? And then I think the second step is to understand what those historical actors were thinking in their own time. That's an essential part of just historical understanding. Yeah. And then once you've got those things in place, then you can move on to what do we think about that, and bring in our own judgment. And I would say that in most cases, teachers should be guiding that discussion rather than telling students what they should think about that.
And I do think that it is really important that we know how to navigate this and bring people closer. I just recently read the book, The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And it's a book I would recommend to every parent and every educator, right? Because it brings up some of the things that you are saying. We only have like 8 minutes left, and I want to give you a chance to talk about what is left unsaid. What do you want to say to this group of people that have been such great? Sarah has been like, Sarah, don't apologize. You are in the right place. We love the bombarding. You are bringing up awesome points here, so don't be shy. But it has been a great audience. So such great questions and comments. But I'm going to start with you, Sonia. What is left unsaid? What do you want people to take away from this conversation?
Yes, so I really focus on the interactions between teachers and children and the language interactions that take place that build not only their language skills, but their knowledge in this case, as they're talking about content-rich topics. And what's compelling to me about the integration of knowledge and literacy and using these high-quality curricula is that these curricula may be improving how children and teachers talk with one another, how talk to each other, how children talk to one another, the language in those conversations. That's something that I'm very interested in. But what I want to make sure that we don't forget is that not only are these curricula important because of the knowledge building pieces, but how that knowledge building piece interacts with their language development is very important.
In the community that it creates, right? You're so right. I mean, it's such a strong community. I'm going to go to you, David. What's left unsaid? What is it that you want people to remember?
When I went to one of the ARC schools, and I've done this in all the others, they'd bring kids out and we would talk about the curriculum, especially since at that time it was really new to them. And I would ask, what are the things that they like? What's good about this curriculum? And then I would ask, well, what don't you like? What's not good, or what would you like to change? And in this one school, I couldn't get an answer at all. The kids just could not come up with anything they didn't like. And I kept, I could be pretty persuasive with kids. I kept saying, oh, come on, there must be something. Isn't there something stupid about this career, what you're doing here? Isn't there something boring? Didn't you read the instruction manual for being a kid? And this one little girl named Brooklyn pipes up after everybody thought for a minute, and she says, there's an instruction manual? The point of the story is that they really had to wrestle to figure out what they didn't like. It's a far more meaningful experience to learn about the world than it is to learn about a series of discrete, atomized skills that you then practice on text at all kinds of levels. And everybody knows from day one in kindergarten who's a D and who's a S and so forth. I think if you would sit down and design a system of literacy education so that the only kids who could come out unscarred and make it are those who come from highly educated, motivated families to begin with, that would be the system that we've been working with, certainly since sometime in the late 80s or early 90s.
And this is different. You're right. Natalie, what about you? What's left unsaid?
Well, I think what I would like to emphasize is, and David was alluding to this, is how engaged students are in these knowledge building curricula. And I've seen this with several of them. And I've compared them, to what goes on in classrooms that are putting skills in the foreground and using leveled reading. And the kids are having amazing, thoughtful discussions. They often don't want the discussions to end. They don't want the reading to end. And we talk about choice, but it's hard to choose to learn about something if you don't know it exists. And what happens with these curricula is they introduce students to topics that they then choose to learn more about. They get very excited about them. And I would also say that what happens, I've talked to teacher after teacher who has told me that basically what a knowledge building curriculum does is it changes their teachers' expectations for what kids can do. And that is especially true for the kids who would normally be in the lowest reading group, the kids with IEPs, the kids who are still learning English, that they blossom the most. All kids thrive, but those kids blossom the most once they are given access to the same content, complex content, interesting, engaging content that their peers are given access to, that they are often the ones who come up with the most insightful comments in class discussion. And that changes everybody's idea of who those kids are and what they're capable of doing.
That's right. It reminds me, I always say that the shift from business as usual to a knowledge building curricula is like going from watching a tennis match that the teacher is sending the ball to one kid and the ball is coming back to the teacher and then she gives it to another kid, to looking more like a basketball. Multiple players touch the ball before it goes out off balance to the coach to say something. And I have that visual in my mind. I want to thank you so much for this thoughtful discussion. I want to thank the audience. What an audience. It has been really incredible. But I want to let you know about what's coming next. So thank you so much, Natalie, Sonia, and of course, David. But I want to call attention to what's coming next. We had a webinar back in August where we kicked off conversations around the science of reading, specifically when it comes to multilingual learners. And we got such positive response that we're going to continue these conversations. And the next one is going to be October 6th. And we're going to start with what were the points of agreement? We have not stopped talking since August, and we have come up with some things that we all agree. And then what are still things that we need to talk some more about? So thank you. I hope to see you. And thank you to our panelists. I'll see you soon.